I was the last kid picked for the Xbox team at Troy's party. Then he let his brother Jacob try to intimidate me before his mom exposed him for bullying. When I confronted Troy about it, he grinned and said, "My mom actually set that up to catch him." I stayed silent. That was 10 years ago. Yesterday, I got a text from Troy asking me to hang out again. When I was 11, a kid named Troy gave me an invitation to his birthday party the next day. My face went pale. Troy was the guy everybody wanted to be friends with, while I was the loner who had panic attacks when called on by the teacher. "Look," he said, "my mom is making me invite you because she feels bad that nobody ever invites you to stuff." I felt humiliated, but I also hadn't been to a birthday since 2nd grade, so I said I'd be there. Troy mumbled something about pizza and video games, but what he didn't mention was that his older brother Jacob would be there. Jacob was 13 and was known for hardcore bullying uncool kids. I went home and tried on every shirt I owned, which wasn't many, practiced conversations in the mirror. My mom was practically glowing when I told her about the invitation. She immediately went out and bought a gift card, wrapped it in paper that wasn't too babyish but wasn't trying too hard either. I Googled how to be cool at parties and memorized the top 10 tips. Don't talk too much. Laugh at jokes. Don't be the first or last to leave. I even practiced my laugh to make sure it didn't sound too eager or too fake. The next day, Troy's mom answered the door with this huge smile. "You must be Ben. I'm so glad you could make it." She actually seemed genuine, which made it worse somehow. She turned to Troy and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Make sure you include him in everything." "Okay, honey." The other kids looked at me like I was a math problem they had to solve. The party started exactly how you'd expect. When they picked teams for Xbox, Troy said, "Ben's on my team," while his mom watched from the doorway. When I managed to get a kill in Call of Duty, Troy practically shouted, "Great job, Ben," like I just cured cancer. The other kids cheered too, but one of them rolled his eyes when he thought I wasn't looking. During pool time, I did a cannonball that actually was pretty good. The kids laughed and clapped, but I heard Jake whisper to Connor, "We have to be nice, remember?" Troy shared his special edition controller with me, but only after his mom walked by the sliding glass door. When the pizza came, they made room for me at the table, but conversations kept dying whenever I tried to join in. They'd explain their inside jokes with this patient tone, like they were teachers or something. But then something weird happened during Capture the Flag. They let me plan the strategy, probably expecting nothing, but I'd actually been thinking about tactics while I watched other kids play at recess for years. When my plan worked and we destroyed the other team, Troy's high five felt different. Dude, that was actually genius. Things started shifting. During the present opening, I'd gotten him this book about coding games because I'd overheard him talking about wanting to make his own. His polite thank you turned real when he started flipping through it. "Wait, this is actually sick. How do you know I wanted this?" By cake time, something had loosened. The laughter felt less like a performance. One kid forgot to be fake nice and just treated me normal, arguing with me about whether PlayStation or Xbox was better. That's when I saw Jacob at the upstairs window staring down at us in the backyard. My stomach dropped. Troy must have noticed because he immediately squirted me with a water gun. "Tag, you're it." But I saw his eyes flick nervously to the window. We kept playing, but 10 minutes later, Jacob was there again. This time, Troy's mom was up there too, saying something to him that made him scowl. The party continued, kids actually talking to me like I was just another kid. We were all in the living room playing Mario Kart. When Jacob finally came downstairs, the room went quiet. Jacob scanned the room like a predator, his eyes stopping on me. I was sitting on the couch holding a controller, clearly the outsider who'd gotten too comfortable. He stared at me for what felt like forever. Then he pulled his shirt slightly up, revealing the tucked BB gun. He put his hands in his pockets and took out a few bullets. A smirk spread across his face like he was about to do something. He turned and walked back upstairs. My hands were sweating on the controller. The other kids exchanged glances, but tried to keep playing. A minute later, we all heard his footsteps coming back down. Jacob appeared in the doorway holding the BB in his hand now. He took one step toward me and then, "Jacob, get over here now." Troy's mom's voice cut through everything like a knife. She appeared behind him and grabbed his ear, actually grabbed it, and started dragging him toward the back door. Through the window, we could see her absolutely laying into him. His face went from smug to shocked to embarrassed in about 3 seconds. We couldn't hear the words, but her finger was pointing at him, then at us, then at him again. She marched him back inside. Jacob stood there red-faced, his mom's hand on his shoulder. "I'm sorry for what I was about to do," he mumbled. "He won't be bothering you boys again," she announced. "Have fun." She gave Jacob one last glare before he stomped upstairs. The room exploded back to life. "Dude, did you see his face?" someone said. Troy looked at me and grinned. My mom actually set that up. She'd heard complaints about him being a bully and knew he'd try something. She wanted to catch him in the act. The rest of the party was amazing. I had completely forgotten about how this invite was never genuine, and for those last remaining hours, it actually felt like I had real friends. When Connor's mom came to pick him up, he actually said, "See you Monday, Ben." Like it was normal. By the time my mom came, I'd exchanged gamer tags with 3 kids. Troy even said something about hanging out next weekend. I left with this feeling I couldn't describe, like something had shifted in the universe. But then I came back to school on Monday. Troy wasn't there, but the other kids were. Dude, did you hear about Troy? What happened when you tried to hide an injury from your parents? When I was 9 and scraped my knee falling off my skateboard, my father made me lie on the kitchen table while he carved the wound deeper with a scalpel because he believed shallow injuries would keep recurring unless you completed them. Dad had this twisted theory that the body remembered unfinished injuries and would recreate them over and over until they reached their intended depth. He claimed he'd discovered this through years of working as an EMT and seeing the same people with similar wounds repeatedly. Mom had left when his obsession started and took my sister, but somehow I got stuck with him. He kept medical journals filled with drawings of wounds at various stages and calculations about optimal depth for permanent healing. After he finished carving my knee that first time, he bandaged it with professional precision and explained that now I'd never scrape that knee again because we'd satisfied the injury's full potential. The fact that I never did injure that exact spot again only reinforced his delusion. From then on, every bump, bruise, or cut had to be completed to prevent recurrence. A paper cut meant he'd slice down to muscle. A bruised shin meant he'd systematically bruise the entire leg. He had this whole philosophy about how modern medicine created chronic patients by treating symptoms instead of completing the injury cycle. He'd lecture me while cutting into my skin about how he was saving me from a lifetime of repeated trauma. His toolkit lived in a sterile metal cabinet in the bathroom, like he was running a legitimate medical practice. He had scalpels for cuts, hammers for bruises, and needles for punctures, all organized by size and purpose. He'd put on surgical scrubs and gloves before each session and document everything in his journals with photographs and measurements. The worst part was how he'd calculate exactly how deep or extensive each injury needed to be based on formulas he'd created. A 2-in cut required deepening to 1 in. A bruise needed to cover the entire muscle group. He'd mark my skin with surgical pens before beginning and work with the focus of a surgeon while I screamed. I learned to hide injuries at all costs. But Dad did daily body inspections where I had to strip naked and turn slowly while he examined every inch. Finding a hidden injury meant the completion would be twice as severe as punishment for trying to let it heal naturally. My teacher noticed me limping from a completed ankle injury and called home, but Dad convinced her I had a rare genetic condition that caused spontaneous wounds. He actually forged medical documents and got a corrupt doctor friend to back up his story. The school bought it and even gave me special accommodations for when I couldn't walk after his sessions. One day I got a concussion playing basketball and tried to hide it from him. For 2 days I fought through the dizziness and nausea, terrified of what completing a head injury would mean. But Dad noticed my dilated pupils during inspection and went ballistic. A head injury left incomplete could repeat forever. He screamed, dragging me to the kitchen. "Do you want to spend your whole life getting concussions?" He showed me his journal entries about traumatic brain injuries and how they needed to reach their full potential to prevent recurrence. His completion plan involved inducing a more severe concussion to satisfy what my brain was trying to achieve. He made me put on a football helmet and positioned my head against the wall while he prepared to strike it with a baseball bat. I begged him to stop, but he explained this was the only way to prevent a lifetime of head trauma, one properly completed concussion, now or dozens of incomplete ones forever. He said, practicing his swing, "I'm saving your future." That's when I finally fought back and managed to lock myself in my bedroom. He spent hours pounding on the door with his bat, screaming about how my brain would never heal properly without completion. I could hear him flipping through medical journals and recalculating the force needed for optimal injury completion. For 3 days, I survived on water from my bathroom sink while he camped outside my door. He slid diagrams under the door showing brains with incomplete trauma patterns. He played recordings of doctors discussing chronic concussion syndrome. On the 3rd night, I heard him on the phone with someone discussing sedation options for uncooperative patients. The next morning, he managed to pick my lock while I was sleeping. I woke up to him standing over me with a syringe and the baseball bat. "Don't worry," he said as I tried to scramble away. "Dr. Walker is coming to help. He agrees that your concussion needs completion, but thinks we should do it under controlled conditions." I jumped out my window and ran to the neighbors, but Dad followed completely calm like this was normal. He explained to them that I had a dangerous, incomplete head injury that could kill me if left untreated. He showed them his forged medical credentials, and Dr. Walker pulled up in his van with what looked like official hospital equipment. The neighbors started looking uncertain as Dad described the medical necessity of completion therapy. Dr. Walker approached me with another syringe while Dad held up the bat. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way," he said, "but that concussion is getting completed today." As they backed me into a corner, Dad lifted the bat above his head and said the most terrifying words of my life. "Hold still, son. I calculated exactly where to hit to complete the injury without killing you, probably." The neighbors took a step back when they saw the bat raised, but their 12-year-old daughter had her phone out recording everything from their upstairs window. I twisted hard and broke free from Dr. Walker's grip, sprinting toward the street, screaming for someone to help me. A mail truck screeched to a stop right in front of me, and the driver, this older guy with military tattoos on his arms, jumped out and put himself between me and Dad. Tom, the mail carrier, had his phone out calling 911 while using his truck to block Dad from getting to me. Dad stayed completely calm and started explaining to the neighbors gathering on their lawns about my dangerous, untreated concussion that could kill me without immediate medical intervention. Dr. Walker pulled out official-looking papers and showed them around, talking about chronic injury recurrent syndrome and how I needed emergency treatment. Some of the neighbors started nodding and looking at me with concern instead of Dad with suspicion. The police showed up 8 minutes later and found me clinging to Tom's arm while Dad stood there in his scrubs looking professional and concerned. Dad handed the officers his forged medical documents, showing I had this rare genetic condition that caused spontaneous wounds and required completion therapy to prevent recurrence. The officers looked confused when Dr. Walker confirmed everything Dad said and showed his own medical license and credentials. I pulled up my shirt right there on the lawn and showed them the dozens of scars covering my chest and back, each one measured and straight like they'd been done with surgical precision. The officers' faces changed immediately when they saw the pattern of cuts at different stages of healing. Dad insisted I'd done them to myself because of my condition, but the neighbor's daughter ran over with her phone showing the video of Dad threatening me with the bat. While Dr. Walker prepared the syringe, the officer separated me from Dad and Doctor Walker immediately and called an ambulance while more police cars arrived. At the hospital, I sat in this small examination room, jumping every time a nurse or doctor came near me with any kind of medical instrument. The nurse, Patricia, moved real slow and explained everything before she touched me, checking my concussion symptoms and taking pictures of every scar on my body. I kept asking if Dad could get into the hospital and find me, but Patricia promised security knew not to let him near the pediatric ward. Detective Sarah Moore from Child Protective Services showed up with a camera and started documenting each scar while I explained what original injury Dad had been completing. She found records showing I'd been to the emergency room 43 times in 5 years, every single visit signed off by Dr. Walker as the attending physician. 3 hours later, Detective Moore told me I'd be going to an emergency foster home while they investigated and that Dad had been arrested but would probably make bail soon. I panicked and told her he'd find me and finish completing the head injury, but she promised my location would be kept secret from everyone, including the school. The foster parents were this older couple who'd dealt with abused kids before, and they showed me to a small bedroom that had a lock on the inside of the door. They told me I controlled who came in and showed me how the lock worked from inside. I tested it over and over, then pushed the dresser against the door anyway before trying to sleep. The next morning, Detective Moore came back with bad news that both Dad and Dr. Walker had posted bail, and Dad's lawyer was claiming I'd had a psychotic break from my untreated concussion. The school had given them all the accommodation records supporting Dad's claims about my rare genetic condition, and the lawyer was using them to argue Dad was a concerned father trying to help his mentally ill son. She said she was also trying to find my mom and sister, but Dad had filed papers years ago saying Mom abandoned us and didn't have any custody rights. I told her Mom had to leave because Dad started talking about completing injuries on my little sister after she got a splinter, and Mom knew she could only save one of us. She chose to take Sarah and run while I stayed behind to keep Dad from hunting them down. The way his dad turned every single injury into this whole medical procedure is so strange. I'm really curious how someone even comes up with a theory like completing wounds to stop them from happening again. Detective Moore wrote everything down while I explained how Mom begged me to come with her that night. But I knew Dad would never stop looking if we both disappeared. The foster home they put me in felt like another planet where people moved slowly and spoke in soft voices. I'm trying to understand how his dad convinced so many people this was real. Did Dr. Walker actually believe in this completion theory too, or was he just going along with it for some reason? Every car that drove past the window made me jump because I kept thinking it was Dad coming to take me back. The foster parents had this old orange cat that climbed onto my lap while I sat frozen on their couch, too scared to move in case I did something wrong. When the cat started purring against my chest, something inside me broke, and I started crying because I couldn't remember the last time anything touched me without causing pain. The foster mom just sat across from me reading a magazine like crying 9-year-olds were totally normal in her house. 2 days later, Detective Moore picked me up to meet with Mrs. Rodriguez, the school counselor who'd asked about my limp last year. Mrs. Rodriguez pulled out a thick folder and showed Detective Moore 3 different reports she'd filed about my injuries over 2 years. Each time, Dad had shown up with medical documents from Dr. Walker explaining my rare condition, and the school administration decided everything was fine. She handed over copies of everything, including photos she'd secretly taken of bruises on my arms. That same afternoon, Dad's lawyer filed emergency papers saying I needed immediate medical care for my concussion and foster care was endangering my life. The hearing got scheduled for the next morning, and Detective Moore spent all night at the foster home making phone calls and gathering documents while I paced my room unable to sleep. At the courthouse the next morning, I saw Dad for the first time since I jumped out my window. He wore his best suit and looked exactly like a worried father should look standing with his lawyer and Dr. Walker near the metal detectors. When we made eye contact, he mouthed the word incomplete at me, and I started hyperventilating so bad the foster parents had to shield me with their bodies, while Detective Moore called for security. During the emergency hearing, Dad's lawyer showed the judge medical journals about something called completion therapy, and had 3 other parents testify over the phone about how Dad had helped their kids. Judge Freeman kept frowning at the papers, but seemed worried about the concussion thing and ordered an independent medical evaluation before he'd make any custody decisions. They sent me to Dr. Torres, this child psychiatrist who spent 3 hours asking me questions and taking notes about every scar on my body. I ended up explaining Dad's whole system to her, showing her how I knew exactly which blood vessels to avoid when cutting and how to calculate wound depth based on muscle density. She looked more and more upset as I described Dad's treatments like I was giving a medical presentation, because that's the only way I knew how to talk about it. 3 days later, they enrolled me in a new school under a fake name. While the investigation continued, the other kids kept asking why I wouldn't play dodgeball or why I freaked out when I got a paper cut during art class. The school nurse had to help me calm down when I saw the blood and started calculating how deep Dad would make the completion cut. She gave me Band-Aids and let me sit in her office until my hands stopped shaking. Detective Moore called that week saying she'd found out Dr. Walker had lost his medical license 5 years ago in Texas for unauthorized human experimentation. She'd also tracked down 3 families who'd filed complaints against him before suddenly moving out of state. She said we couldn't use it in family court yet, but it opened up a whole criminal investigation. The foster parents drove me to a pediatric specialist who took x-rays of my whole body to document the old injuries. The images showed fractures in my ribs and arms that had been deliberately rebroken multiple times instead of being allowed to heal properly. The radiologist got so upset looking at the films that she called the police herself to make sure everything got officially recorded. A week later at my foster home, I scraped my elbow on the sidewalk and immediately started shaking. The foster mom found me trying to hide in the bathroom with paper towels pressed against it. She didn't force me to show her, but just sat on the floor outside, talking about how she understood being scared of getting help. After an hour, I finally opened the door and let her look at it. She showed me the antibiotic ointment tube before opening it and explained exactly what she was doing. When she finished putting on the Band-Aid without trying to make the scrape worse, I actually started crying. That night, they made mac and cheese because I'd mentioned it was my favorite, and for the first time, I took the dresser away from my bedroom door. I still locked it, but at least I could get out faster if I needed to. Detective called the next morning saying she'd found something important about my mom. She drove over and sat with me in the living room holding a folder full of papers. She'd tracked down my mother, Karen, living in California with my sister through old court records. Mom had been fighting for custody for 2 years, but Dad used his medical connections to get her declared mentally unstable. Detective showed me copies of psychiatric evaluations that Dr. Walker had signed, claiming Mom had dangerous delusions about Dad hurting me. The report said she'd abandoned her children due to paranoid fantasies about medical abuse that never happened. Mom had already boarded a plane to Portland with boxes of her own evidence after Detective called her. 3 days later, Detective drove me to the CPS office to meet her. I barely recognized the woman waiting in the conference room, even though she looked exactly like my sister. She stood up when I walked in, but I backed against the wall when she moved toward me. She stopped and just stood there crying while Detective explained I might need time. Mom pulled out old photos of us before she left. Pictures of me at 5 years old without any scars, smiling and playing at the beach. Then she showed recent photos my sister had drawn of what she remembered about me. My sister joined on video call from California and immediately started sobbing when she saw my face. She kept saying she was sorry they left me behind and asking if I remembered teaching her to ride a bike. I didn't remember much about either of them, but seeing my sister cry made something hurt in my chest. The next day, Dad's lawyer filed emergency paperwork claiming Mom was trying to profit from a custody battle. He submitted documents showing Mom had a history of mental illness and had voluntarily abandoned her children. The papers included signed statements from 3 different psychiatrists saying she was delusional. Mom's lawyer proved all 3 psychiatrists worked at facilities where Dr. Walker had privileges. She showed the judge phone records of Dr. Walker calling each doctor the day before they wrote their evaluations. The lawyer also found that Dad had been paying Dr. Walker $5,000 a month for consultation services. 2 weeks passed before Dr. Amanda Torres finished her evaluation and testified in court. She told the judge, "I had complex PTSD from years of medical child abuse." She explained that completion therapy had no scientific basis and was just torture disguised as medicine. She'd reviewed Dad's journals and said his theories showed clear signs of delusional thinking. The judge ordered me to stay in foster care while the criminal trial proceeded. That same week, Dad hired a private investigator who started following Detective's car. The investigator got caught taking pictures outside my school with a telephoto lens. The principal called the police and they arrested him for stalking a minor. He admitted Dad paid him to find where I was living so he could monitor my medical condition. Detective moved me to a new foster home that night for safety. I spent the first 3 days with my dresser and bed pushed against the door again. The new foster family had another kid named Marcus, who was 16 and had been removed from his home 2 years earlier. He sat outside my door the third night and told me through the wood about his stepdad who used to beat him. He explained how he learned that not all adults wanted to hurt him and that being scared was normal. He said it took him 6 months before he could sleep without barricading his door. After an hour of listening to his story, I opened the door just enough to see his face. He was sitting cross-legged in the hallway with old scars on his arms that looked like mine. 3 days later, I started seeing a specialist who worked with kids who'd been through medical abuse. She spread actual medical journals across her desk, showing me real science about wound healing. Every single thing Dad had taught me about completion therapy was completely made up. She showed me studies proving that deepening wounds caused more scarring, not less. She explained that bodies healed naturally without needing to complete anything. I kept arguing with her because accepting it meant all those years of pain were for nothing. During the supervised visitation hearing 2 weeks later, Dad brought 3 sets of parents to testify. They all claimed his treatments had helped their children avoid chronic injuries. One mother said Dad's completion therapy had cured her son's recurring bruises. Detective recognized the family's name from Dr. Walker's old complaint files at the medical board. Under cross-examination, the mother kept looking at Dad before answering questions. When the lawyer asked if she'd been paid to testify, she started crying. She admitted Dad had offered to pay off their $30,000 medical debt if they supported him. The other 2 families quickly left the courtroom when they heard that. How did Mrs. Rodriguez keep taking those photos for 2 whole years without anyone catching her? The way she secretly collected all that proof while Dad kept showing fake papers makes me wonder what else teachers noticed but can't prove. Mom's lawyer then presented phone records showing Dad had called my maternal grandparents 47 times with threats. The foster mom just sitting there reading while this kid cried makes me wonder if she'd seen so many hurt children that she knew exactly when to give them space versus when to step in and help them. He told them he'd have them arrested if they tried to contact me. The lawyer showed emails where Dad described exactly how he'd isolated me from everyone who might help. He'd switched me from public school to homeschooling after teachers asked questions. He'd told neighbors I had a rare disease that made me injury-prone. He'd created an entire paper trail of fake medical conditions to explain away the evidence of abuse. The new detective they assigned to my case kept checking his phone during our meetings and forgot basic details from one session to the next. My foster parents noticed him mixing up dates and missing obvious connections that Detective Moore would have caught immediately. They started calling the department daily, demanding Moore's reinstatement, and within days, other families she'd helped were flooding the chief's office with letters and phone calls. The pressure worked because 2 weeks later, Moore walked back into my case with a stack of files and a determined look that made me feel safer than I had in weeks. During week 10, Dad's lawyer filed a motion to get all my therapy records, claiming they needed to check if I was making things up or had mental problems that made me unreliable. My therapist fought hard against it, but Judge Freeman ruled that some records had to be shared for the case to proceed fairly. I sat in the waiting room while they argued, knowing Dad would read every private thought I'd shared about nightmares and panic attacks and how scared I still was of him. That same week, my foster family's German Shepherd started following me around the house, somehow knowing when the anxiety was building before I even realized it myself. The dog would press against my legs when my hands started shaking or curl up next to me on the couch when the memories got too loud. My foster parents watched this happen over and over, and I heard them talking one night about maybe making this arrangement permanent if the court would allow it. Karen's lawyer dropped a bomb in court when she presented pages from Dad's journal that described future experiments he wanted to try once I turned 12. The entries detailed burn completion procedures using controlled heat sources and calculations about scar tissue formation rates. Judge Freeman's face went pale as he read about Dad's plans to use a soldering iron to complete minor burns, and his theories about how fire injuries needed to reach third-degree status to prevent recurrence. The courtroom got so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights buzzing while everyone processed what Dad had been planning. A week later, I met with a child advocate, the court app appointed, who actually asked me what I wanted. Instead of just telling me what would happen, she had me draw pictures and use dolls to show what living with Dad was like. And for the first time, someone really listened when I said I never wanted to be alone with him again, not even for supervised visits. 3 months into everything, Dr. Walker's trial started, and I had to testify through a video link from another room because I couldn't handle being in the same building as him. I described the baseball bat and the syringe and how he'd pulled up in his van, ready to help Dad complete my concussion, breaking down twice when the prosecutor showed pictures of the medical equipment they'd found. Walker's lawyer tried to say I was confused from the head injury, but I remembered every detail from the surgical scrubs he wore to the exact words he used about controlled conditions. Detective Moore got reinstated with a commendation and immediately discovered Dad had been posting on medical forums under fake names trying to find other doctors who believed in completion therapy. She found threads where he described my case as a success story and offered to train other parents in his methods, even sharing diagrams of optimal cutting depths for different age groups. The investigation expanded when they found 3 other families Dad had been counseling online about completing their children's injuries. By this point, I'd stopped pushing my dresser against my bedroom door at night, trusting the locks and the German shepherd who slept in the hallway outside my room like a furry guardian. My foster parents didn't make a big deal about it, but I saw them smile at each other when they noticed the furniture back in its normal spot. Then Dad's parents showed up from Arizona with expensive suits and a team of lawyers claiming their son was a misunderstood genius who just needed psychiatric help, not prison. They filed for custody themselves, saying they could provide a stable home and proper medical care while their son got treatment. And suddenly, Karen's public defender looked completely outmatched against their legal team. The forensic accountant the prosecutor brought in found something huge in week 14 when she discovered Dad had been billing insurance companies for every completion session using diagnostic codes for legitimate procedures and getting Dr. Walker to sign off as the attending physician. The fraud totaled over $200,000, which meant federal charges on top of everything else. And Dad's parents' lawyers suddenly had a much bigger problem than just the abuse charges. The next week, my sister testified via video link from California, and watching her on that courtroom screen broke something inside me. She sat in a bright room with palm trees visible through the window behind her and described how Dad held her down when she was 6 to complete a bruise on her arm while I screamed and begged him to stop. Her voice stayed steady, but her hands shook as she explained watching him use the hammer on her bicep, calculating each strike to spread the bruising across the entire muscle group. While Mom stood frozen in the doorway, she showed the camera the scar tissue that still marked her arm 7 years later. And Judge Freeman called a 15-minute recess because even the court reporter looked sick. That night, my foster parents found me helping their younger son, Marcus, with his math homework, and I actually enjoyed explaining fractions using pizza slices and candy bars. They watched from the doorway as I walked him through each problem with patience I didn't know I had. And afterwards, my foster mom mentioned I might make a good teacher or even a doctor someday, someone who actually helps kids instead of hurting them. The thought stuck with me all night as I imagined using everything Dad taught me backwards, healing instead of completing, and for the first time, I pictured a future beyond just surviving. 3 days later, the prosecutor offered Dad a deal where he'd admit guilt and give up parental rights for only 5 years in prison, but Dad refused immediately. His own lawyers looked frustrated as he went on about how history would vindicate completion therapy and future generations would see him as a pioneer in preventative medicine. He actually tried to submit his journals as evidence of scientific research until his lawyer physically took them away from him. Then, everything went crazy in month 4 when Dad's mother showed up at my school, demanding to see her grandson. The principal tried to explain about the protection order, but she kept screaming about grandmother rights until they had to lock down the entire building. I heard her voice from my classroom as she pounded on the main doors, and my body just shut down completely. They found me unconscious under my desk, and the ambulance ride became a blur of oxygen masks and concerned faces while my foster parents followed behind. The hospital kept me overnight for observation, and Detective Moore added the protection order violation to the criminal charges against my grandmother. Meanwhile, Sarah tracked down a man named Robert, who'd been one of Dr. Walker's first experiments 20 years ago. Robert drove up from Eugene with medical records showing the nerve damage from childhood completions that still caused him daily pain. He agreed to testify about the long-term effects and showed Sarah photographs of scars covering his legs where Walker had completed minor scrapes with surgical precision. His testimony would prove this wasn't just about Dad, but a pattern of abuse Walker had been perfecting for decades. Dr. Torres introduced art therapy during our next session and handed me crayons like I was 5, but I didn't care. For an hour, I just drew. And when she asked what I'd made, I realized it was a house with a garden and a fence and no medical equipment anywhere. My foster parents framed it on the refrigerator next to Marcus's spelling test, and every time I passed it, I felt something loosening in my chest. During the custody hearing, Dad suddenly stood up and looked right at me, despite his lawyer grabbing his arm. "I only wanted to perfect you," he said before security pulled him back down. I froze in my seat, unable to move or breathe, while Judge Freeman cited the outburst as proof Dad couldn't recognize the harm he'd caused. Mom underwent her psychological evaluation in week 18, and the evaluator confirmed she posed no danger despite the trauma from years of Dad's abuse. She admitted needing therapy herself to deal with the guilt of leaving me behind, and the evaluator noted her genuine remorse and commitment to healing. The report recommended supervised visits, building toward eventual custody, which felt both exciting and terrifying. Then Dr. Walker got convicted on 15 counts, including fraud, assault, and practicing medicine without proper oversight. The judge sentenced him to 15 years but offered possibility of parole if he testified against Dad, which he accepted immediately. His testimony revealed Dad had been writing a book called Completion Therapy: A Parent's Guide and had connected with other parents online about training them in his methods. 47 phone calls to the grandparents. How did he find time between all those completion sessions? How exactly does someone convince 47 different doctors that carving up a kid is normal medical treatment? The way his dad built this whole fake medical history with made-up diseases makes me wonder what kind of research he did to make it all sound believable. The way he built this whole fake medical story for the neighbors while doing real damage is mind-blowing. The prosecutor showed printed emails where Dad described his techniques and offered to mentor other parents in preventing their children's recurring injuries. That night, I asked my foster parents if kids who got hurt could ever be normal adults. They called their oldest son David, who'd been adopted 15 years ago after surviving abuse that made my story look mild. David taught high school biology and coached basketball and told me that normal was overrated anyway. "Being a survivor makes you stronger than normal," he said, showing me pictures of his own kids and his teaching awards. "We know how to fight through anything because we already survived the worst." 5 months later, the news vans showed up outside the courthouse after Dr. Walker got convicted on all charges. The reporters kept my name out of it, but Dad's face was everywhere with headlines about the worst medical child abuse case in Oregon history. Letters started arriving at my foster home from people who'd survived their own abuse, telling me I was brave and sending drawings and cards. The social worker brought boxes of mail, and we spent afternoons reading messages from strangers who understood what it felt like to have parents who hurt you. Dad's parents suddenly appeared on TV claiming their son was a misunderstood genius whose theories would revolutionize medicine someday. They hired some fancy PR firm and launched a website called Understanding Completion Therapy, with Dad's journals edited to sound scientific instead of crazy. Detective Moore called me into the FBI field office downtown where agents were tracking down everyone who visited the site. They found 3 other families asking about the therapy for their kids and had to send emergency welfare checks to make sure no one else was getting hurt. The federal prosecutor explained they were investigating my grandparents for funding what might be considered promoting child abuse across state lines. I started group therapy with 5 other kids who'd been through medical abuse, though I was the youngest by 3 years. The older kids talked about surgeries they didn't need and medications that made them sick while their parents collected sympathy and attention. One girl named Sarah had 37 unnecessary operations before someone finally believed her that she wasn't really sick. We drew pictures of our scars and talked about how weird it felt when people treated injuries like normal accidents instead of analyzing them. The therapist kept writing notes about how I helped the older kids understand their own trauma by explaining Dad's theories in simple terms. Karen finally got approved for unsupervised visits after 6 months of supervised ones. We met at the park with the duck pond, and she brought bread to feed them like we used to when I was little. Neither of us talked about the case or Dad or anything heavy. We just threw bread and watched the ducks fight over it. Then I tripped on the playground and scraped my knee pretty bad on the concrete. Karen just cleaned it with a wet wipe and put on a regular Band-Aid from her purse. We both started crying watching that Band-Aid stay in place without anyone talking about completing anything. She held me while we sat on the bench and cried about a stupid scraped knee that would heal normally. 3 weeks later, Dad's criminal trial started with the prosecutor warning the jury they'd see evidence of systematic torture disguised as medical treatment. She showed them photos of my scars and explained how each one came from Dad completing minor injuries. Dad's lawyer argued he had delusional disorder and needed psychiatric help, not prison. He claimed Dad genuinely believed he was helping me and couldn't understand his actions were harmful. The jury looked sick when the prosecutor showed them the metal cabinet full of surgical tools Dad used on me. My foster parents officially filed adoption papers, saying they wanted to keep me permanently if Karen couldn't get full custody back. They also offered to support any arrangement that would work for everyone. Maybe keeping me in foster care while Karen got stable, or doing some kind of open adoption. Karen actually seemed relieved to have options that didn't require choosing between all or nothing. She met with my foster parents at a coffee shop, and they worked out a plan where I'd stay with them, but Karen would get regular visits building up to weekends. The prosecutor presented Dad's journals as evidence and had a medical expert translate his clinical language into plain English. When Dad wrote patient exhibited therapeutic vocalization, the expert explained it meant I was screaming in pain. The journal entry about achieving optimal depth penetration for permanent injury resolution meant he cut me down to the bone. The jury looked horrified as the expert went through entry after entry, showing how Dad documented torturing me like it was legitimate research. I went back to regular school part-time using my real name instead of the fake one from witness protection. The other kids didn't know anything about my case since the media never used my name. At recess, I flinched when kids played rough, but slowly learned the difference between normal playground stuff and actual danger. My teacher knew my history and watched carefully, but let me figure things out myself. When I fell playing basketball and got a bloody nose, she just gave me tissues and ice like any other kid. Dad took the stand in his own defense and calmly explained completion therapy like he was teaching medical students. He brought charts showing injury patterns and healing cycles, pointing at diagrams while describing how modern medicine failed patients by not completing wounds. When the prosecutor asked if he understood he'd hurt me, he said pain was necessary for proper healing. He called me his greatest success story, proof that completion therapy worked because I'd never re-injured the same spots he'd completed. The prosecutor asked how many other children he'd tested this on. Dad said I was the only official subject, but he'd been documenting everything since I was 3 years old, earlier than anyone knew. He'd been completing my injuries for 6 years, not 3. He pulled out a flash drive and said it contained thousands of photos and videos of every session. The prosecutor entered it all into evidence, while the jury watched her scroll through hundreds of images of me at different ages crying, while Dad cut into me. The next day, Karen took the stand and I watched my mom for the first time in years as she gripped the wooden rail with white knuckles. She started by explaining how Dad's behavior began with small things like making me hold ice on bruises longer than normal. Within months, he was using medical tools on minor scrapes, while she begged him to stop. She described finding me unconscious in the bathroom after he'd completed a head bump by hitting me with a textbook. Her voice cracked when she told the jury about Dad threatening to complete my sister's broken finger if she called 911. The prosecutor showed photos of me at age 5 with surgical marks on my arms that Karen had secretly documented. She admitted leaving me behind was the hardest choice of her life, but Dad had convinced the courts she was unstable. That night, I sat with my foster parents watching the news coverage, while they helped me understand that Dad was sick in a way that made him dangerous. They explained mental illness doesn't excuse hurting people, but it helps explain why someone might think they're helping when they're actually causing harm. I kept feeling sorry for him, even though my hands shook whenever his face appeared on screen. The next morning, Dad's mother took the stand and shocked everyone by admitting she'd taught him that pain builds character when he was young. She described making him kneel on rice for hours after misbehaving and burning his fingers with matches to teach consequences. The prosecutor pointed out that while this explained Dad's twisted worldview, it didn't excuse escalating to systematic torture. Grandma actually seemed proud of her methods until the prosecutor showed her photos of my scars. My medical team testified after lunch about the nerve damage in my left leg that would never fully heal. They explained how the repeated deepening of wounds had destroyed tissue that couldn't regenerate and left me with chronic pain that would need lifelong management. The physical therapist demonstrated how I'd never have full range of motion in my shoulder where Dad had completed a dislocation. The psychiatrist testified, I'd need years of therapy to process the trauma and might never feel completely safe. The defense brought in their own medical expert who claimed completion therapy had theoretical merit based on ancient healing practices. He argued Dad had simply applied the technique incorrectly, but the core concept of allowing injuries to reach their natural conclusion had validity. The prosecutor destroyed him by showing there wasn't a single peer-reviewed study supporting completion therapy in any medical journal. She made him read from actual medical texts that explicitly warned against deepening wounds. When she revealed he'd been paid $50,000 for his testimony, the jury looked disgusted. He finally admitted he'd never actually treated a patient with completion therapy and had only heard about it through Dr. Walker's online forums. 3 days later, I turned 10, and my foster family threw me my first real birthday party with both them and Karen there. We had chocolate cake and played games in the backyard while everyone pretended not to notice the adults wiping their eyes. When I blew out the candles, my only wish was to never be heard again. Karen hugged me for the first time in years and whispered that she was sorry for everything. Dad's mother burning his fingers with matches when he was little really explains where these twisted ideas came from. Did she realize she was basically teaching him to hurt me the same way? My foster mom took pictures of me actually smiling, which she said was the best present she could ask for. I'm really trying to understand how Dad's mom could sit there and tell everyone she burned his fingers with matches. Did she think that would help his case somehow? Detective Moore testified the next week about discovering similar cases in 5 other states, all connected to Dr. Walker's website about completion therapy. She showed the jury screenshots of forums where parents discussed techniques for completing their children's injuries with detailed instructions and supply lists. The FBI agent who took over explained they were investigating it as a torture ring, disguised as alternative medicine, with over 200 members nationwide. Dr. Walker's arrest had led them to a whole network of people who believed modern medicine was creating weak children by not letting injuries fulfill their purpose. Then came the biggest shock when Dad's father took the stand against him. Grandpa admitted he'd known something was wrong for years, but was too scared of both his wife and son to intervene. He apologized directly to me in court, saying he should have protected his grandson instead of staying silent. Dad showed emotion for the first time during the trial, standing up and screaming about betrayal until the bife forced him back down. His face turned red as he yelled that his father was a coward who never understood the importance of complete healing. The jury only took 3 hours to return guilty verdicts on all 27 counts, including aggravated child abuse and practicing medicine without a license. Dad stared straight ahead, showing no reaction, as the judge read each verdict like he still believed he'd done nothing wrong. The prosecutor had asked for the maximum sentence on every count to run consecutively, which would mean life in prison. That night, I slept without nightmares for the first time since the trial started, and woke up feeling lighter somehow. My foster parents found me sitting in the garden the next morning just watching birds hop around the fountain. When they asked if I was okay, I told them the judge said Dad couldn't hurt me anymore. And for the first time, I actually believed it. 3 weeks later, we were back in the courthouse for Dad's sentencing hearing. The prosecutor had asked me to write a victim impact statement, but I couldn't get the words out. So, Mrs. Rodriguez read it for me while I sat between my foster parents. She told the judge about the years of terror I lived through and how I still woke up screaming about incomplete injuries. She read the part where I asked the judge to make sure Dad could never hurt another kid the way he hurt me. Karen went next and talked about losing years with me and how guilty she felt for leaving me behind when she took my sister. She cried through most of it and kept looking at me like she wanted me to forgive her right there in the courtroom. Then Dad got his turn to speak and stood up in his orange jumpsuit with his hands cuffed in front of him. He looked right at me and said, future generations would understand his genius and that I'd thank him someday when I realized I never got hurt the same way twice. My foster dad had to hold me back when I started shaking because Dad kept going on about how his methods were revolutionary and misunderstood. Judge Freeman cut him off and said it was one of the worst child abuse cases he'd seen in 30 years on the bench. He sentenced Dad to 25 years to life and said he'd never practice medicine again, even if he somehow got out. He gave Karen full custody with a plan for us to slowly reconnect and signed permanent restraining orders against Dad and his parents. The bailiffs led Dad away in chains while he muttered about medical journals and incomplete injuries. As he passed our row, he looked at me and said my concussion was still incomplete before security rushed him out. My support team surrounded me as I stood there shaking, and Mrs. Rodriguez kept telling me it was over now. 2 weeks later, I had my first weekend visit with Karen at my foster home, where we sat in the living room trying to figure out how to be mother and son again. My foster parents worked with her to make sure I felt safe, and Karen understood that I had 2 families. Now, a month after that, Dad's parents tried to get visitation rights through their lawyer, but Judge Freeman shut them down immediately. He said they'd enabled their son's abuse and warned them that any more contact attempts would mean criminal charges. Around that time, I started horseback riding therapy at a stable outside Portland, where the owner had survived her own childhood trauma. She taught me that healing wasn't a straight line, and some days would be harder than others, which helped when the nightmares came back. Detective Moore visited 8 months after everything started to tell me the FBI had shut down the entire completion therapy network. They'd arrested 12 parents across 6 states who'd been following Dad's methods on their own kids. She said I was a hero, but I told her I was just a kid who survived what I had to survive. Then news came that Dad had been attacked in prison by other inmates who found out what he'd done to me. He survived but needed surgery, which seemed ironic considering his theories about completing injuries. I didn't know how to feel about it because part of me didn't want him hurt, but another part felt this dark satisfaction. Karen arranged for family therapy so me and my sister could finally talk about everything that happened. My sister admitted she was mad at Mom for leaving me behind, while I admitted I was mad at her for being the one who got saved. The therapist helped us understand that we'd all been trapped in an impossible situation that wasn't any of our fault. After weeks of talking about where I should live, I finally told the judge I wanted to stay with my foster family during school and visit Karen and my sister on breaks. The judge signed the papers right there in his office, while Karen hugged me and my foster mom smiled. 3 months later, my scars started looking less angry and red after the new doctor gave me special cream to put on them twice a day. The doctor showed me pictures of other kids who had scars and explained they weren't something to hide anymore. I rolled up my sleeves at school for the first time in forever, and nobody even stared at them. Mrs. Rodriguez asked if I wanted to talk to the younger kids about staying safe, and I stood in front of the third-grade class with my hands shaking. I told them if any adult hurt them and said it was medicine or for their own good, they should tell someone right away. The kids asked questions, and one girl came up after and whispered that her uncle did weird stuff to her, so I walked her straight to Mrs. Rodriguez. That summer, my foster family drove us all to this campground where Karen and my sister met us with their tent. We roasted hot dogs and made s'mores, and nobody talked about court or therapy or anything heavy. My foster brother taught my sister how to fish while I helped set up the tents. 6 months after everything ended, I got a letter saying, "Dr. Mitchell was in solitary because he kept trying to hurt other prisoners by offering to complete their injuries. The prison guards found him with a sharpened toothbrush, trying to convince his cellmate that his old stab wound needed to be reopened. I threw the letter away and realized I hadn't thought about him in days, which felt weird but good. Detective Moore called to tell me they were making a new law called Ryan's Law that would make it easier to catch parents who hurt their kids and pretend it's medical treatment. She drove me to the state capitol building where I had to shake hands with politicians who wanted pictures with me. I didn't like the attention, but Detective Moore said my story could save other kids. So I smiled for the cameras. A whole year after I escaped, I went to see Tom, who still delivered mail on our old street. He was putting letters in a mailbox when I walked up with my foster brother, and he dropped his whole bag when he saw me. He kept wiping his eyes and saying how good I looked and how proud he was that I asked for help that day. Tom said I saved myself, but I told him he was the one who believed me when nobody else would. My therapist's office had these soft chairs and pictures of mountains on the walls where I went every week. She asked what I wanted to do when I grew up, and I told her I wanted to be a real doctor who actually helped kids heal the right way. I knew what real pain felt like, so I could help kids who were hurting for real. She wrote in her notebook that I was turning my trauma into purpose, which sounded fancy but made sense. The scars on my arms and legs would always be there, but they just showed I survived. I was going to use everything I learned about real medicine to help other kids and make sure nobody else's dad could hurt them and call it healing. Thanks for exploring all this with me. Seriously, it's been awesome digging into these questions together. Can't wait for our next curious adventure. Like the video, it helps more than you think.